Picture this. 982 years after Christ, somewhere in the brutal waters off Greenland's eastern coast, a longship is dying. Not the dramatic, battle-scarred death you might imagine from the sagas, but the slow, grinding death that cold brings to desperate men. Eric Thornson's vessel creaks through ice that sounds like breaking bones, and every man aboard knows they're sailing toward their own graves. 3 days without food. Think about that for a moment. 3 days. Your stomach stops growling after day 2, it just becomes this hollow, gnawing presence that follows you everywhere. But that's not even the worst part. 7 men are already dead from the cold, their bodies wrapped in whatever scraps of sailcloth the crew could spare, because even in death, you don't waste resources when you're this far from home. The remaining crew, maybe 15 souls, maybe fewer, they're huddled around the last smoking brazier like moths around a candle. Except this, candle is dying, and when it goes out, so do they. Eric had gambled everything on this voyage, everything on finding new settlement lands where his people could carve out a life from the frozen wasteland. But now he's learning what every Norse explorer eventually discovered. The mathematics of survival in these latitudes are brutally simple and utterly unforgiving. Here's something the sagas don't always tell you about Norse expansion. It wasn't just about courage and longships and battle axes. It was about heat. Specifically, it was about staying warm enough to survive winters that could stretch for 8 months in lands where firewood was scarcer than silver. Each winter claimed 1 in 3 settlers, 1 in 3, not from starvation, not from disease, not from warfare with natives, from the simple, fundamental problem of generating enough heat to keep human beings alive, most of them suffocated. Can you imagine? You're trying to escape the cold, so you pile more wood on the rutting, fire, seal up every crack in your dwelling, and then the smoke builds up until you're choosing between freezing to death or choking to death. Others simply ran out of fuel. When your last piece of driftwood burns down to ash, when you've already burned your spare tools and furniture, and anything else that might catch flame, you just wait. The cold creeps in through the walls, through the floor, through your clothes and your skin, until hypothermia takes you in your sleep. This is the reality Eric Thornson faced as his longship scraped against an unknown shore. His men were beyond exhausted, beyond hungry, beyond hope. They'd followed him into the edge of the world, and now they were paying the price for his ambition. But then something extraordinary happened. Something that would change not just their immediate survival, but the entire trajectory of Norse expansion into the North Atlantic. Eric stumbled, literally stumbled, because when you haven't eaten in 3 days, your legs don't always do what you tell them upon a valley that defied everything he thought he knew about this frozen wasteland. Steam rose from the ground like breath on a winter morning, creating an otherworldly landscape that seemed almost supernatural. And scattered across this impossible warm valley were stones, black stones, porous and light, that felt warm to the touch, even in killing cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. Now, Eric was a practical man. He'd survived as a Norse explorer by understanding that mystery usually meant death, and the unknown was generally something that wanted to kill you. But these stones, they radiated heat like they had fire trapped inside them. In a world where warmth meant survival, where every degree of temperature could mean the difference between life and death, Eric had stumbled upon something that might as well have been magic. Here's where the story gets really interesting, because Eric wasn't alone on that shore. Among his crew was an elderly Sami guide, a man who'd been enslaved decades earlier during one of those brutal raids that defined so much of medieval Scandinavian politics. The Vikings had a complex relationship with the Sami people. They raided them, enslaved them, traded with them, sometimes even learned from them. And this particular Sami elder, whose name has been lost to history, recognized those black stones immediately. He called them stones that breathe. And he knew techniques for harnessing their power that had been passed down through generations of people who'd learned to survive in landscapes that would kill unprepared southerners within hours. Ancient techniques, refined over centuries of trial and error, for capturing and directing the heat these volcanic stones could hold. That night changed everything. For the first time in weeks, Eric's men slept warm and dry. The volcanic pumice, heated by the natural steam vents during the day, radiated warmth throughout the long Arctic night. Men who'd been shivering themselves toward death just hours earlier found themselves comfortable, even cozy, surrounded by stones that glowed with captured heat. But here's what Eric understood, what separated him from just another lucky explorer. This wasn't just about surviving one night. This was about revolutionizing Norse expansion itself. These stones could solve the fundamental problem that had limited Viking settlement in the far north. They could make the impossible possible. As dawn broke over that steaming valley, Eric looked at his crewmen who were alive because of these miraculous stones and began to plan. Not just for their immediate return to Iceland, but for something much larger. Something that would transform his family from struggling settlers into the controllers of the most valuable resource in the North Atlantic. Because Eric Thornson was about to become the man who figured out how to bottle fire itself, and that discovery would make him more powerful than any Jarl who'd ever lived, and more dangerous than any enemy who'd ever threatened him. But first, he had to get home alive, and that journey, with a ship's hull packed full of volcanic stones instead of traditional trade goods, would prove to be just the beginning of an adventure that would reshape the medieval world. What Eric didn't know, as he loaded those first precious stones into his longship, was that he'd just started a chain of events that would span generations, trigger wars, and ultimately determine which Norse families would survive to see the new millennium. The stones that had saved his crew were about to become the foundation of an empire and the source of a blood feud that would echo through the halls of history. But that's a story for what comes next. Eric Thornson returned to Iceland with his ship riding low in the water, but not from the usual cargo of silver, amber, or walrus ivory that successful raiders brought home. His hull was packed with volcanic stones, black, porous rocks that looked like worthless slag to anyone who didn't understand their true value. And the reaction from his fellow Jarls was exactly what you'd expect when a respected warrior returns from a potentially profitable expedition carrying what appeared to be ballast. They called him Eric the Fool. Picture the scene. The harbour at Reykjavik, autumn of 982, with the kind of bitter wind that cuts through wool and leather like it's nothing. Other longships were unloading their treasures: Byzantine silk, Frankish weapons, Irish gold, while Eric's crew hauled out load after load of ordinary-looking stones. The laughter started as whispers and grew into open mockery. Bjorn Ironside, the most powerful Jarl in western Iceland, allegedly joked that Eric had lost his mind along with his profit sense, trading real wealth for pretty rocks that his children could play with. But here's the thing about mockery. It has a way of dying very, very quickly when winter arrives. That winter was particularly brutal, even by Icelandic standards. The kind of season that old men still talked about decades later, when the wind howled for weeks without stopping, and the cold was so intense it cracked timbers and split stones. In Longhouse after Longhouse across the settlement, families faced the same deadly choice that had plagued Norse communities for generations: burn more fuel and risk suffocation from smoke, or conserve wood and risk freezing to death in your sleep, except in Eric's hall. Eric's longhouse stayed warm and smoke-free, while neighbouring halls filled with choking fumes and layers of ice on the interior walls. The method Eric employed was elegantly simple, which is often the mark of true innovation. He'd learned from that elderly Sami guide and probably improved upon the technique through his own experimentation to create layers of volcanic pumice beneath raised sleeping platforms. During the day, these stones absorbed heat from carefully controlled fires. At night, they radiated that captured warmth for hours, creating a steady, comfortable temperature without the need for constant burning. Think about the transformation this represented. For the first time in Norse memory, women weren't coughing blood from smoke-damaged lungs. Children could play freely instead of huddling by dangerous open fires. Food preservation improved dramatically in the dry, consistently heated environment. Clothes stayed dry, tools didn't rust from condensation, and people could actually sleep through the night without waking up shivering. Word of Eric's innovation spread like wildfire through the settlement network, carried by thralls, traders, and the occasional brave soul who ventured out during winter storms. By spring, when the ice finally broke and travel became possible again, Eric found himself the most sought-after man in Iceland. Desperate neighbours offered him their daughters in marriage, seasoned warriors swore loyalty oaths, established jarls proposed trade partnerships, all for the secret of the stones. But Eric wasn't sharing, and that decision would prove to be both his greatest strategic move and his most dangerous gamble. Bjorn Ironside had stopped laughing. When you're the most powerful jarl in Western Iceland, when your authority depends on controlling resources and commanding respect, having a former fool suddenly possess something everyone desperately wants becomes a direct threat to your position. Bjorn demanded that Eric reveal his source, not as a request between equals, but as an order from a superior to a subordinate. Eric's refusal was delivered in the traditional Norse fashion, publicly, definitively, and with just enough insult to make backing down impossible for either man. He essentially told Bjorn that some secrets were worth more than gold, and this particular secret would stay within his family. What happened next was inevitable. In a culture where personal honor was more valuable than life itself, where perceived weakness invited immediate challenge, Bjorn had to respond. On a moonless night in early summer, 30 armed men moved silently toward Eric's compound. But here's where Eric's innovation proved useful in ways he'd never anticipated. The battle that followed became the stuff of legend, told and retold in halls across Scandinavia for generations. Because Eric and his loyal warriors used the heated stones themselves as weapons. Imagine the scene. 30 raiders expecting to overwhelm a smaller force through surprise and superior numbers, suddenly finding themselves in a landscape transformed into something from a fever dream. Eric's men had prepared for this possibility, creating strategic stockpiles of heated pumice near crucial choke points around the settlement. When the attack began, they poured water over these scorching stones, creating walls of scalding steam that confused attackers. In the darkness, visibility dropped to arm's length. The raiders, used to coordinated assaults, found themselves stumbling through clouds of vapor, unable to distinguish friend from enemy. The heat was overwhelming, not just hot, but the kind of wet, penetrating heat that saps strength and makes breathing difficult. Eric's defenders, knowing the terrain and prepared for the conditions, could move efficiently while their attackers flailed in confusion. The psychological effect was probably as important as the tactical advantage. These were hardened warriors who'd faced shield walls and axe fights, but they'd never encountered anything like this. The stones seemed to breathe steam like living things, creating an otherworldly battlefield that felt more supernatural than military. 7 men died that night, including Bjorn's eldest son, Ragnar, who'd been positioned to inherit his father's power and wealth. The young man was found at dawn, scalded and confused, having apparently stumbled into a steam vent during the chaos. Some accounts suggest he actually drowned on dry land, his lungs filled with superheated vapor. That death transformed what might have been a simple raid into something much more dangerous, a blood feud that would span generations. In Norse culture, the killing of a jarl's son, especially an heir, created obligations that couldn't be ignored or negotiated away. Blood demanded blood, honor required vengeance, and Bjorn Ironside now had a sacred duty to destroy Eric Thornson and everyone who'd helped him. But Eric had also proven something crucial. His stones weren't just useful for staying warm. They could be weaponized, they could change the nature of warfare itself, and they could level the playing field between a smaller force and superior numbers. As he surveyed the aftermath of that terrible night, the dead scattered around his steaming compound, his own men exhausted but victorious, Eric understood that his discovery had moved far beyond simple innovation. He wasn't just Eric the Warmkeeper anymore. He was Eric the man who controlled a resource that could determine who lived and who died, who held power and who lost it. The stones that had saved his crew from freezing were about to reshape the political landscape of the entire North Atlantic. And every jarl, every king, every ambitious leader from Norway to Greenland was about to learn that the balance of power had shifted in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. But first, they had to survive what was coming next. Because Bjorn Ironside wasn't the type of man to accept defeat quietly, and a blood feud with the most powerful jarl in Iceland was just the beginning of Eric's troubles. By the year 1000 after Christ, something remarkable had happened in the North Atlantic. The power structure that had defined Norse society for centuries, based on controlling forests for timber, commanding fleets of longships, or holding the best agricultural land, had been completely overturned. Now, the key to dominance lay in controlling Greenland's volcanic fields, and Eric Thornson had become something unprecedented, a jarl whose authority stretched across ocean basins. They called him Eric the Warmkeeper now, and that title carried weight from Iceland to Vinland. But this wasn't just about one man's rise to power. Eric had created something that historians would later recognize as the first truly industrial monopoly in medieval Europe, a systematic, organized operation that controlled every aspect of volcanic stone production and distribution. Think about the scale of what Eric accomplished. He established a network of loyal settlements across Greenland, each one bound not just by traditional oaths of fealty, but by strategic marriages that created a web of family obligations spanning the entire colony. His son Leif, who would inherit not just knowledge but a sophisticated business empire, commanded an operation that would make modern corporate executives envious. Secret quarries, guarded by trusted warriors who'd sworn blood oaths of loyalty. Specialized ships designed specifically to transport massive quantities of stone without compromising cargo stability. A network of spies tracking anyone who might be attempting to steal their methods or establish competing operations. This wasn't the simple raiding and trading that characterized most Norse economic activity. This was systematic resource control on an unprecedented scale. The economic transformation was staggering. Traditional jarls who'd built their power on controlling Norway's vast forests suddenly found their timber nearly worthless. Why struggle to transport heavy, bulky wood across dangerous ocean passages when volcanic stones could provide superior heating with a fraction of the fuel requirements? Eric's allies grew wealthy trading stones for silver, weapons, and slaves, while established power brokers watched their influence evaporate. But the real revolution was in what this technology enabled. For the first time in Norse history, settlements could survive and even thrive in regions previously considered uninhabitable. The Vinland colonies, those ambitious attempts to establish permanent Norse presence in North America, suddenly became viable. With volcanic heating systems, colonists could survive harsh winters that had previously driven them back to Greenland or Iceland. Greenland itself experienced unprecedented growth. Communities that had struggled to maintain a few dozen souls expanded to hundreds, then thousands. By the early 1100s, some estimates suggest the total Norse population in Greenland reached 5,000 people, an enormous number for such a harsh environment. Explorers pushed further north than ever before, establishing seasonal camps and hunting stations in territories that would have been death traps without reliable heating technology. This expansion created a feedback loop of increasing power. More settlements meant more warriors, more resources, more political influence. Eric's family wasn't just controlling a useful technology anymore, they were reshaping the demographic map of the North Atlantic. But success of this magnitude inevitably breeds conflict, and the opposition that emerged was formidable. A coalition of Norwegian jarls, led by powerful families who'd seen their traditional advantages neutralized, decided that Eric's monopoly had to be broken. These weren't desperate raiders like Bjorn Ironside. These were sophisticated political operators with resources, connections, and the kind of strategic thinking that had built the Norse expansion in the first place. The Battle of Steam Valley erupted in the spring of 1006, and it represented everything that medieval warfare could become when innovation met desperation. The Norwegian coalition brought over 300 warriors to Greenland, the largest military force the island had ever seen. Their plan was straightforward: seize the primary volcanic quarries, capture or kill Eric's technical specialists, and break the monopoly through overwhelming force. Leif Erikson, yes, the same Leif who would later become famous for his North American explorations, commanded the defense, and he demonstrated the kind of tactical brilliance that would later make him a legendary explorer. But this wasn't about courage or individual heroism. This was about understanding terrain and technology in ways that his enemies simply couldn't match. Leif's forces used their intimate knowledge of the volcanic landscape to create what modern military analysts might recognize as the first recorded example of environmental warfare. They didn't just fight in the steaming valleys, they turned the valleys themselves into weapons. Picture the scene. Hundreds of warriors struggling through a landscape that seemed designed to confuse and disorient. Leif's men created artificial fog banks by pouring water over strategically placed heated stones, reducing visibility to just a few feet. They led enemy forces into carefully prepared killing fields, where natural steam vents created choke points and ambush opportunities. The psychological impact was devastating. These Norwegian warriors were experienced fighters, but they'd never encountered anything like this. The ground itself seemed hostile, breathing steam and heat in patterns that made no sense to men accustomed to conventional battlefields. Weapons became slippery from condensation, armor grew uncomfortably hot, and the constant noise of hissing steam made coordination nearly impossible. 200 men died in that battle, 200 seasoned warriors lost in a single engagement. The surviving jarls, those who managed to escape the steaming hell that Steam Valley had become, signed treaties acknowledging Eric's family's absolute control over the stone trade. But more importantly, they spread word throughout Scandinavia about what they'd witnessed, a new kind of warfare that turned the landscape itself into an ally. Yet even as Eric and Leif celebrated their victory, a different kind of threat was emerging. Christian missionaries had arrived in Greenland, and they brought with them a perspective on the volcanic stones that would prove far more dangerous than any military assault. These weren't the typical missionaries who focused solely on conversion and religious instruction. These were educated men, many of them trained in the intellectual traditions of medieval monasteries, who understood that knowledge was power. While they publicly condemned the stones as pagan magic and preached against their use, they were secretly documenting every detail of the heating techniques. The irony was brutal. Eric had successfully defended his monopoly against military assault, political pressure, and economic competition. But he was about to lose it to something much more insidious: the systematic spread of information by people who understood that knowledge, once released, becomes impossible to control. The Christian strategy was brilliantly subversive. They positioned themselves as opponents of the stone technology while simultaneously learning everything they could about it. They gained the trust of Eric's people by appearing to share their resistance to change, all while preparing to undermine the very foundation of his power. What Eric didn't realize, as he watched those black-robed figures moving through his settlements, was that they represented the beginning of the end for his stone empire. The technology that had made his family wealthy and powerful was about to become common knowledge, and when that happened, everything would change. But that transformation wouldn't happen overnight, and in the years before the knowledge spread, Eric and Leif would use their monopoly to achieve something remarkable. They would extend Norse presence in the North Atlantic by the centuries, reshape settlement patterns across multiple continents, and fundamentally alter the trajectory of medieval exploration. The stones that had started as a desperate survival tool were about to write their names into the permanent history of human expansion into the world's most challenging environments. The slow collapse of Eric's stone empire began not with the clash of weapons or the roar of burning longships, but with something far more insidious: knowledge spreading like water through cracks in stone. And ironically, it was the very people Eric had helped the Irish monks fleeing Viking raids, the captured thralls seeking any advantage that might improve their circumstances, the Christian missionaries he'd allowed into his settlements, who would ultimately undermine everything he'd built. Irish monks, those remarkable scholars who'd preserved much of classical learning through the chaos of the early medieval period, were among the first to adapt Eric's techniques. Fleeing Viking raids that had devastated monasteries across Ireland, they carried construction knowledge to Scotland, where modified versions of volcanic heating began appearing in monastery design as early as 1015 after Christ. But here's what made their adaptation so significant. They weren't just copying Eric's methods. They were improving them, systematizing them, and most importantly, documenting them in ways that the largely illiterate Norse culture never had. Detailed architectural drawings, step-by-step construction guides, even theological justifications for using what had previously been condemned as pagan magic. The monks were creating an intellectual framework that would outlast any individual monopoly. The process accelerated when captured thralls began revealing preparation methods under torture. This is one of those brutal realities of medieval life that we sometimes gloss over. Information extraction through violence was standard practice, and slaves who possessed valuable knowledge were particularly vulnerable. Within 20 years of the Steam Valley victory, detailed accounts of stone preparation, heating techniques, and construction methods were circulating among Norse communities that had never seen Greenland's volcanic fields. By 1050, volcanic heating systems had appeared everywhere from Russia to Normandy. The technology was spreading faster than Eric's family could track, let alone control. Each new implementation created additional sources of knowledge, additional experts who could teach the techniques to others, additional communities that no longer needed to trade with Greenland for heated stones. The Catholic Church's role in this transformation was particularly cunning. Initially opposed to the volcanic stones as devil's work, church leadership had strategically rebranded them as God's provision for faithful Christians surviving in harsh lands. This wasn't just theological flexibility, it was calculated appropriation of useful technology. Pope Gregory VII actually issued a papal bull in 1073, declaring that volcanic heating was a divine gift meant to help Christian communities survive in lands where Satan's cold seeks to destroy the faithful. Suddenly, what had been Eric's pagan innovation became sanctified Christian technology, complete with liturgical blessings for new installations and prayers for the souls of those who developed the original techniques. By 1100, what had been the source of Viking dominance in the North Atlantic had become common knowledge throughout medieval Europe. The strategic advantage that had made Eric's family wealthy and powerful was gone, dissolved into the general pool of human knowledge. But here's the remarkable thing. The collapse of Eric's monopoly didn't diminish the importance of his innovation. If anything, it revealed the true scale of what he accomplished. The technology fundamentally altered settlement patterns across the North Atlantic. Regions that had been considered barely habitable became attractive to colonists who could now survive harsh winters with reasonable comfort and safety. The demographic shifts were enormous populations that had been concentrated in the most sheltered, temperate areas, could now spread into territories that offered other advantages: better hunting, strategic locations, mineral resources. More importantly, Eric's heating systems had extended Norse presence in Greenland by an estimated 300 years. Without volcanic heating, most historians agree that the Greenland colonies would have failed much earlier, probably by the mid-1100s rather than surviving into the 1400s. That additional longevity meant generations of exploration, cultural exchange, and geographic knowledge that shaped European understanding of the North Atlantic. The innovation also revolutionized Nordic architecture in ways that persisted long after the original monopoly ended. Traditional Norse construction had been limited by the need to balance heating efficiency against smoke management and fire safety. Eric's systems eliminated those constraints, enabling larger buildings, more complex layouts, and architectural innovations that influenced Scandinavian design for centuries. Archaeological evidence discovered in the 20th century validated many aspects of the story that had been dismissed as saga exaggeration. When researchers excavated Greenland settlement ruins in the 1930s and 40s, they found sophisticated heating systems that perfectly matched descriptions from medieval sources. Stone-lined channels, carefully constructed airflows, raised sleeping platforms positioned to maximize radiant heat, all exactly as the old stories had described. Modern volcanic analysis revealed that Eric's stones were indeed a specific type of pumice, with exceptional heat retention properties. The particular combination of porosity, mineral content, and thermal mass found in Greenland's volcanic fields was uniquely suited to the heating applications Eric had developed. In other words, his discovery hadn't just been luck. He'd stumbled upon one of the best natural materials for passive heating systems anywhere in the medieval world. The technology that began with one desperate explorer trying to keep his crew alive had enabled the colonization of previously uninhabitable regions, extended Norse territorial control across ocean basins, revolutionized domestic architecture, and fundamentally altered the demographic development of the North Atlantic. Today, you can visit restored Viking longhouses in Iceland that still use Eric's heating method. Modern engineers have refined the systems, improved the efficiency, and added safety features that medieval builders couldn't have imagined. But the basic principle remains unchanged: volcanic stones, heated during the day and radiating warmth through the night, creating comfortable living spaces without the smoke, fire hazards, and fuel consumption that had limited earlier construction. Thousands of visitors marvel each year at rooms that stay warm through howling winter storms without visible flame or choking smoke. Children play comfortably in spaces that would have been uninhabitable using traditional Norse heating methods. Families sleep soundly while Arctic winds rage outside, protected by a technology that was revolutionary 1,000 years ago and remains effective today. The stones continue their ancient work, breathing warmth into cold northern nights just as they did when Eric Thornson first discovered them in that steaming Greenland valley. They serve as a testament to human ingenuity, born from the edge of survival, to the way desperate innovation can reshape entire civilizations, and to the enduring power of simple solutions to fundamental problems. But perhaps most importantly, they remind us that history's greatest innovations often come not from abundance and security, but from moments when survival itself hangs in the balance. Eric Thornson's stones saved his crew from freezing to death, and in doing so, they changed the course of medieval exploration, altered settlement patterns across continents, and extended human presence into some of the most challenging environments on Earth. The legacy written in those volcanic stones continues today, not just in the restored longhouses that tourists visit, but in the broader understanding that human survival often depends on recognizing opportunity in unlikely places, adapting ancient wisdom to immediate needs, and having the courage to gamble everything on innovations that others might dismiss as foolishness. Eric the Warmkeeper's empire may have crumbled, but his stones still breathe warmth into the world, carrying their ancient fire through centuries into our modern age.